So, like I said, he tends to use the root 1 form of the chord rather than the root 6 form. You'll get some interesting chord voicings, and sometimes the stuff that you hear him do, it sounds more complicated than it is. And if you're trying to figure out, it can initially stump you. But once you figure it out, you're kind of like, duh, that's so easy. Why didn't I think of that? And if you're trying to learn Led Zeppelin songs and, you can't figure out what he's doing, try something simple, because it's usually he's done something simple that you wouldn't necessarily suspect. The other side of the coin is that many of Jimmy's songs, particularly the acoustic ones, do use the non-standard tunings that we talked about, that either Jimmy, some of them he invented himself or is certainly responsible for bringing them to rock. And some of them are, very, very well-known tunings, but they're usually not open chord tunings like the kind of things you get with Keith Richards. Keith uses open chord tunings. Jimmy's tunings are different. And he was also one of the first players to popularize like the drop D tuning.
That's when you take the lower E string a step down to D.
Yeah. And that gives you all kinds of interesting riff possibilities.
Which songs did he use that?
I knew you were going to ask me that. Let me think about that.
Let's see. 10 Years Gone. Kashmir.
No. Kashmir's not in drop D.
That's Celtic tuning. That's right. Yeah. 10 Years Gone is drop D. Kashmir is Celtic. That's D-A-D-G-A-D. Friends is open C tuning. C.
Moby Dick is in drop D. 10 Years Gone is, I guess, in drop D. I guess Going to California's intro is in drop D. The most obvious example would be Moby Dick. That one.
Yeah.
So in addition to the chords he uses and the things he's doing that way, some of the most characteristic Page trademarks involve Jimmy's very unique sense of rhythm. We talked a lot about Iommi's sense of rhythm. Page's sense of rhythm is very unique too. We've talked about this a little too. He's very synced up to and plays off of what the drummer does and what the drummer has given him. It's pretty clear that he's often guiding his drummers on what to play so that he can work off of what they're playing. And characteristic things are like stop-start rhythms in Black Dog and Hot's On for Nowhere and Out on the Tiles, and staccato accents along with what the drum is doing that are synced up with the snare drum, for example, on like Achilles' Last Stand, where he's going da 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 da. That is the kind of thing I'm talking about, where he and the drummer are doing the same rhythmic figure on the two instruments at the same time. There's a lot of that also in like the Wanton Song and Custard Pie. So with me, I don't know. But the point is, he is very synced up with the drummer in a way that a lot of players just sort of use the drummer as a metronome or a glorified metronome. Jimmy's always doing more interesting things than guitarists will play along with the accents. And these are things that are, like I said, they've become very much heavy rock, heavy metal staples, but they come from Jimmy Page, really, again. And it's hard, in fact, to use these things in your music without sort of nodding your hat to Zeppelin. It's almost a Zeppelin cliche to use some of these techniques in your own music. The way it's like if you tap, you're still going to be associated with Eddie on some level, right? If you try to still tap on guitar, if you use Zeppelin cliches in your music, people will associate that with, he's doing a Zeppelin thing. And, maybe you get away with it. It's fine. But, if you go too close to the sun, you burn up. So there's this other thing that he does that is very characteristic. And I call it turning the beat around. I don't know what you would really call this musically, but where it sounds as if the whole song stutters briefly, and we can play an example of this, but you can hear it on things like Royal Orleans and on the Coverdale Page album, Pride and Joy, where the whole song seems to stutter and then the beat goes from one beat to like turns around. Yeah. And most of these Jimmy Page trademarks are so associated with Led Zeppelin and so familiar, and in some cases so cliched, that it's easy to just gloss over them when you're listening to Led Zeppelin for enjoyment. So it's important to note that most of these examples I'm talking about come from Led Zeppelin. even after he was out of Led Zeppelin, Jimmy's post-Zeppelin work still contained all of these elements. And you can hear this stuff a lot in Outrider and on Coverdale Page, which are both very much like rhythmic resumes of what he's about rhythmically. Both of those albums have all of these Jimmy Pageisms on them. And then, people say, oh, this is why, he sounded like, he was ripping off himself in Led Zeppelin. No, this is just the way he plays. This is part of what's his sonic signature. This is his DNA as a player, is to have this rhythmic sense and these rhythmical kinds of ideas, And so it's always there. Jimmy Page plays a fair amount of slide guitar, not tons and tons, but as an effect, you can hear it on Whole Lotta Love. Sometimes it's part of like the solo and What Is and What Should Never Be, which we've talked about. It's a slide solo.
In My Time of Dying.
That's the tour de force. I mean, that's Jimmy going absolutely bonkers with the slide. And it's one of the best Zeppelin tracks of all time, in my opinion. It's just so awesome from everybody's perspective. And he just goes off on slide guitar there, and basically it's totally badass. And of course, it's one of Bonham's best tracks, in my opinion. It's one of everybody in that band's best tracks. We talked a little about his lead playing. He's, like I said, almost exclusively a pentatonic player, mostly minor, some major. But, there are times he will slip in chromatics and, certain other notes. And then, of course, occasionally he will use other scales. He will go for those Eastern flavors and throw in some more exotic stuff. But, I mean, it's more of a seasoning thing rather than the bread and butter. The bread and butter is the pentatonics and the blues scale stuff. You get plenty of hammer-ons and pull-offs and flashy repeating patterns and things like that. We talked about the fact that many of these licks are now considered, these Jimmy Page licks are considered stock hard rock licks now. And, how influential they were. His picking is very much a 70s style, blues style of picking. He's not what you'd call a pure alternating picker guy. He doesn't have that level of facility with his picking hand. He's rather sloppy picking hand by modern standards.
Pretty heavy-handed, too.
When he wants to be, he's heavy-handed, and when he wants to be, he can back that off and be pretty light. Back in those days, a lot of the guys weren't using the tiny, heavy, small picks that they use for lead these days. Most of these guys are using like medium thin picks that are the normal, Fender size pick size and stuff. And they were just doing that at that point in time. When he was doing his solos, he claims he didn't usually compose his solos. He admits to working out a phrase or two. His approach, he claims, was to wing it. And the quote that I have is, he'd usually just limber up, record 3 solos, and pick the best one. And that's pretty amazing when you think about it. In the live setting, Jimmy would, obviously go off and do other things. But if the whole story about Stairway to Heaven solo was like, he had worked out the entrance and he had worked out the exit to the solo. But the middle part, he kind of went in and winged it. And there were 3 or 4, I don't know, something like you can find 3 or 4 takes of that, and they're all available. You can hear them. And the one that we all know from the song is clearly the best of the bunch, but his other takes were sort of impromptu. So he didn't like some people will go in and work out everything from the beginning note to the last note. He would work out a bit of it, and then the rest of it, he would sort of leave the door open for improvisation. And, again, live, they would extend all these numbers, and you'd get, even in like the Stairway to Heaven solo, they would extend that to ridiculous lengths of being long and drawn out. Interestingly enough, it still mostly worked, but it didn't have quite, that impact of that tight solo that we all know and love from that song. But in a lot of cases, like Dazed and Confused could go on for a half hour.
Yeah,
and
just mix some random songs in there from other songs.
And it was just that was that era of players, and guys would do that in those days. That's what you would get live. But in the studio, most of his solos were fairly concise. He would stretch out on occasion. There are some longer ones. The solo in Achilles' Last Stand is pretty long. But, he'd sometimes do a short one too, like in Celebration Day. It's a quick little 16-bar thing.
And very melodic too, like the one in No Quarter. I really like that one. It's very unique.
Yeah, it's just, it's a lot of raunchy attitude in that song. And it's like, he was great at like, you're right. It's super melodic and super memorable, right?
Yeah.
You can remember them, you can hum them for the most part, but there's just like loads of attitude there too in a lot of these songs. And whatever that attitude needed to be. And sometimes the attitude's raunchy and sometimes the attitude is not. And sometimes it's something else, but he was always able to come up with the right thing, whether it was a long solo or a short solo. And there's a story where he was like talking about, the Achilles' Last Stand solo, and John Paul Jones was saying, "You're not going to be able to solo over this. This is a weird progression. You're not going to find anything that's going to work." And Jimmy was saying, "No, I already know what I'm going to do over this. It's going to be just fine. Just trust me." And he comes out and pulls that ridiculous solo out. Some people think that's sort of like, we'll talk about it when we talk about Presence, but that's one of those tracks that people talk of like, point to as like sort of an early metal track, if you will.
Right.
It's compared to a lot of the other things, and that's a term Jimmy never wanted associated with Led Zeppelin. He runs away from that association the way Clapton runs away from being a guitar hero.
Right.
So we're down to vibrato. With Jimmy, you get some wide bends, but his vibrato itself is pretty narrow and quick and thin, kind of like himself. You don't get much whammy bar at all because he's always on a Les Paul or a Telly, but occasionally you get that B bender thing in, and mostly I can't remember where that is. It's on Zeppelin, but it's more in the Firm. You'll hear that thing more in the Firm because he was using that guitar in the Firm, but that's about the story with his guitar style.